Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending where you're from. Welcome and thank you for joining us for this important discussion as we explore the issue of inclusive and democratic governance in the Middle East and North Africa and examine the challenges and prospects in 4 specific countries. Namely, we're dealing today with Egypt, Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria. My name is Tamara Kharoub. I'm the Deputy Executive Director and Senior Fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. And we are very happy to be organizing today's event in partnership with the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. Thanks to everyone involved in the planning of this webinar, Lana Kaptan and Nabil Sharaf at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and many thanks to Coco Tate, Mimi Kirk, and Fida Adeli at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. Just briefly, and for those of you who don't know, Arab Center Washington, D.C. is an independent research organization focusing on the study of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and North Africa, with special attention to issues of human rights, democracy, international law, and just and peaceful resolution to conflict. And 2025 is our 10th anniversary, believe it or not. Our mission here in Washington, D.C. is to provide Arab perspectives, Arab and indigenous perspectives to U.S. policy conversations, and to center human and rights-based approaches to policymaking. And this is why today's topic of this webinar is critical to our work. Now we're almost a decade and a half after the Arab uprisings of 2011, and countries across the Middle East and North Africa continue to grapple with the political transitions, economic challenges, and social movements as people across the region continue to push for greater representation, for democratization, and governance reforms. During the discussion today, as I mentioned, we'll be focusing on the 4 countries, each with its own path and unique sets of challenges that we'll get into during the discussion. Syria, for example, is undergoing a fragile transition with tensions arising regarding forming an inclusive government, democratic processes, and a transitional justice process, while dealing with the post-conflict reconstruction, economic development, and the refugee return. Lebanon has emerged from a 2-year political vacuum with a new president and prime minister, signaling a potential shift towards stability amid the ongoing economic and security challenges and demands from the people for structural reforms. Egypt reverted to an entrenched authoritarian regime as the government struggles with security and economic challenges while cracking down on political opposition and closing civil society spaces. Iraq is striving to assert its sovereignty as it navigates a delicate balance between state building, sectarian politics, and external influences. And there are some common threads between some of the countries, and I look forward to hearing about all this from our excellent lineup of experts joining us today. The discussion will explore the evolving landscape of governance, the obstacles and opportunities for building inclusive and democratic systems. We will examine the barriers to political participation and democratic processes, the role of external actors, the weaponization of sectarian divisions, and the challenges of various armed groups and their diverging agendas. Hopefully, we can also look at some ways in which the United States and international actors can play constructive roles in supporting transparent economic development and recovery efforts and promoting democratic reform and inclusive governance. Again, we are very fortunate to have this lineup of experts with us today. I will introduce them in speaking order. Thanks to all of you for taking the time and joining us for this important discussion. First, we have May Sadani. She is the Executive Director of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, and she will be speaking about Egypt. Ibrahim Al-Asil is Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute, and he'll be talking about Syria. Marcin Al-Shammari is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Boston College, and she'll be talking about Iraq. And Imad Harb is the Director of Research at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and will focus on Lebanon. Thank you again for being with us and for offering your insights. In terms of format, I will give each speaker about 10 to 12 minutes to present their prepared remarks, and then we will engage in discussion and some questions from the online audience. And on that note, I would like to remind our audience that you can send in your questions at any time during the discussion today using the Q&A feature on Zoom. Or if you're watching on social media or on YouTube, please use the email to send in your questions to events@arabcenterdc.org. Please identify yourself and to whom your question is addressed. And please try to avoid lengthy comments in the interest of time so we can take as many questions as possible. And with that, without further ado, we can begin the discussion. I would like to start with May and focusing on Egypt. May, it is no secret that President Sisi, currently in his third six-year term in office, has entrenched the authoritarian rule in Egypt through rights abuses and crackdown on dissent, while directing government resources to security and mega construction projects. What is the current state of freedoms and the democracy movement in Egypt? What are the primary obstacles and prospects for government reforms and a transparent democratic process? And what recommendations would you offer in order to achieve this? May, go ahead.
Thank you, Tamara, and thank you for having me. 14 years ago, people across the MENA region, like you mentioned, took to the streets in what would capture the attention of the world as the Arab Spring or the Arab uprisings, a brilliant show of people power fueled by the aspirations of everyday people for freedom, dignity, and social justice. This wave of protests would usher in what has been an incredibly dynamic period for the MENA region, a period of revolution, counter-revolution, exile, coup, war, authoritarianism, and even a second wave of protests in 2019, and much more. Like you said, in my remarks today, I'll focus primarily on Egypt, where the January 25 revolution resulted in the overthrow of the Mubarak regime. It was followed by a period of painful battles where revolutionaries were targeted by the army in incidents our audience may remember, like the Maspero massacre, Mohammed Mahmoud, and the cabinet clashes. In the months to follow, we would have the election of Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood, his ousting in a coup alongside the violent dispersal of the Rabaa Square sit-in, and ultimately the path to the presidency of Sisi, who, as you mentioned, remains in power today. As we look to Egypt, 14 years after the January 25 revolution, what are the prospects for inclusive and democratic governance that the Egyptian people sought when they took to the streets, and that many have continued to mobilize for on the ground, online, and in diaspora since? The short answer is that those prospects obviously don't look great. You explained the context earlier. But the longer answer necessitates a look into an Egypt that finds itself in a deeply unsustainable situation, exacerbated by an economic crisis, geopolitical pressures, and an increasingly tightening space for any form of dissent, political or otherwise. On the economic front, and despite promises made to the IMF, Egypt has failed to make the structural reforms that Egyptian and international experts alike say are necessary to bring the country out of crisis. As our audience may know, one of the greatest obstacles has been the outsized role of the military in the economy, as the benefits that they enjoy discourage fair competition, further entrench corrupt practices, and disincentivize private investment. Egypt has failed to bring all state-owned enterprises, including military companies, within a unified framework for transparent financial management. It has ended tax exemptions for state-owned enterprises, but not for military companies. And the military's overall share of the economy has continued to grow, alongside its role in economic policymaking as well. Egypt today finds itself in a severe debt crisis. It's begun selling state assets to meet its debt obligations, raising concerns around foreign influence in the economy. All the while, it's failed to slow down massive spending on glitzy mega projects that do not respond to the priorities and needs of Egyptian citizens. Sisi himself has refused to put his people first. In fact, there's one famous quote that's attributed to him where he speaks to Egyptians. If progress, prosperity, and development come at the price of hunger and deprivation, Egyptians, do not shy away from progress. Don't dare say it is better to eat. To me, this quote is demonstrative of a government that does not view putting the needs of the most vulnerable as an obligation or responsibility. Rather, in Egypt today, the cost of the debt crisis is actively being shifted onto the poor and middle classes through a regressive taxation system. Prices are increasing, including on essential goods. In May of last year, for example, we saw a 300% increase in the price of subsidized bread, an item that is essential to the daily meal of an average Egyptian family, and that was front and center in chants within the 2011 revolution. All the while, the poverty rate has reached around 30%. When journalists, analysts, and advocates have raised questions about the economy or critiqued economic policy, they have been arrested and prosecuted. Between January and March 2024, for example, Amnesty International documented 4 cases of the arrest and detention of individuals in 3 governorates who complained about price hikes and comments on social media. In October of that same year, a few months later, economic commentator and analyst Abdel Khaliq Farouk was arrested on charges of joining a terrorist organization and spreading false news for criticizing Sisi's economic policies in many of his published articles. But the economy is not the only issue for which the platform for expression, organizing, and assembly is tightening in Egypt. Since 2014, we've seen the weaponization of a number of vaguely worded provisions across new and existing laws used to go after independent thinking and dissenting opinions. Laws from the penal code to the cybercrime law, from the counterterrorism law to the media law. Artists, journalists, social media influencers, civil society workers, and politicians have been detained and brought to trial for the content that they produce. In some cases, the content they reshare or repost. Most recently, of course, we saw that tens of protesters who gathered in solidarity with Palestinians amid Israel's aggression on Gaza were arrested. After being critiqued for years for its abuse of pretrial detention, Egypt is finally beginning to reduce its pretrial detention population. However, the way in which it is doing this is entirely disingenuous and has come alongside a new criminal procedure code that threatens to take the country's due process protections back decades. Instead of releasing detainees who they've now held in custody for years and who have not been referred to trial, authorities are instead speedily referring cases to trial, with hefty prison sentences expected for those perceived to be critical of the government. All the while, independent media outlets like MENA Masr continue to apply for licenses only to be rejected or ignored by the state, and civil society organizations are now being made to register under an NGO law that is deeply restrictive. The space for political contestation remains nearly non-existent. Ahead of the 2023 presidential elections, through which Sisi was elected for a 3rd term of 6 years, as you mentioned, the only serious opposition candidate, Ahmed al-Tantawi, saw his campaign volunteers and staff targeted, was prevented from collecting and filing the necessary endorsements from citizens, and ultimately was arrested himself and on appeal sentenced to 1 year in prison. He remains behind bars as we speak today. In the lead up to parliamentary elections expected to be held later this year in 2025, there is thus no expectation that independent political parties will be allowed to meaningfully contest the vote. Rather, the expectation is that candidates presented as alleged independent voices, but in fact are close to the state and the security apparatus, will be put forth. And rumors are already spreading that the constitution may be amending to allow for a 4th term for Sisi. In addition to what's happening within its borders, Egypt has also intensified its practice of transnational repression, targeting its dissidents in exile and diaspora through problematic practices like surveillance, refusal to issue passports and other nationality documents, and harassment campaigns. Most recently, Egypt participated in a campaign which ultimately led to the deportation of poet Abdurrahman al-Qaradawi from Lebanon to the UAE. Through these tactics, Egypt seeks to curb the power of organizing even beyond its borders. In an environment in which civil society is targeted, independent media is shuttered, individual advocates are detained, the space for political contestation is tightened, and is a sham at times, and attempts to silence even those operating abroad are made. The potential for Egyptian citizens to bring about inclusive and democratic governance seems far-fetched, but it's also critical to know that even in this impossible environment, there are Egyptians finding ways to continue their work. Abroad, they are establishing organizations that conduct advocacy with international stakeholders, that hold perpetrators to account in international fora, and that provide access to information that is difficult to get inside the country. And within the country's borders, Egyptians are challenging bad legislation in court and via parliament. They are providing legal aid to those in need. They are documenting violations and reporting on them. They are producing media coverage to challenge the state narrative within the spaces that they have. And they are committed to articulating alternate policy ideas. As I close, I want to step back to the MENA region as a whole. Much has been written about whether the 2011 Arab uprisings and the movements that would follow have succeeded or failed. Others have quipped that revolutions take decades, and it's too soon to determine the impact of these consequential developments. Instead, I want to end by grounding our audience here in one undeniable gain and one tangible area that gives me hope in the face of what appears to many as a seemingly hopeless region. The Arab uprisings helped an entire generation, myself included, across an entire region redefine their place in society, re-exert their rights to demand better of their governments, articulate the visions, policies, and strategies necessary for an alternate way forward, and find each other. This potential, this human capital, is the region's superpower. And it's also what will be essential for any change in our region, irrespective of how it comes. While the politics and the geopolitics may not always be in our immediate control as advocates, we are seeing what this looks like today in Syria, where there's an entire generation that is ready to offer ideas to reshape their country's future and to push their new government. So until the domestic environments allow in our countries, let's at least center ourselves in the region's people, because they are not going anywhere and they are already at it in ways that you may not immediately see. Thank you.
Thank you, May, for this comprehensive analysis of the current situation in Egypt, and also for bringing us back and centering the role of people across the region. And the great transition you gave me to our next speaker. Now we move on to Ibrahim, and hopefully we can go back to you, May, and talk about some recommendations as well, because I'd like to hear from you about your thoughts on this. But for now, I'd like to move to Ibrahim and focusing on the current conditions in Syria. Ibrahim, the fall of the Assad regime presents both, as everybody knows, opportunities and significant challenges to the country. We've seen a Sharia-appointed president and HTS members filling the majority of government positions, while there remain disagreements among Syrians, divisions among armed groups, and various other challenges that the country is facing. What is the current state of the transition in Syria? Are there any efforts to implement inclusive governance that represents the diversity of the Syrian population, and maybe a serious will among the new leadership for a democratic process? We've seen, the word democracy hasn't been part of the process so far. What are the main challenges to achieving these goals, and what the recommendations you might offer to address these obstacles?
Thank you, Tamara. Thanks for having us and moderating this event, and also to Lana and Coco and everyone who helped with this. Great questions that they helped me organize and structure my answers, and I'm gonna build on some of the comments that May eloquently shared with us. On December 8th of last year, the Assad regime fell, and with that fall, the state virtually collapsed inside Syria. And that's very important to understand or to try to analyze where Syria is today and what kind of structure we have, what kind of institutions are there, and what also types of political cleavages we're talking about inside Syria. We're talking about not only a legacy of 13 years of local civil war and regional war and a global war. We're not only talking about uh, uh, 54 years of rule of one family and the tyranny, but also more than 6 decades of a rule of the Ba'ath Party, a totalitarian party of Syria, that was also followed by 2 years of union with Egypt under the leadership of Nasser, who actually eliminated and banned all the political parties inside Syria, all independent media. So we're talking about a country since late 50s really didn't have freedom of speech, didn't have the ability to organize parties, didn't have the ability to form some political participation, and all of that is really important for democratization. Uh, After independence, Syria probably had like a few years of very, very, very fragile democracy. So also we don't have something to look at and try to rebuild or to resurrect as a democratic experience. Syria technically is building its democratic experience from scratch, and all of that is on a devastated society and state. We're talking about 90% of the population is below poverty line, so the middle class almost does not exist in Syria anymore. We're talking about unemployment rates probably between 35 to 45%. In some sub-regions, it reaches 85 to 90%. So almost nobody has jobs in those regions. We're talking about the country that gets 1 to 2 hours of electricity a day. So also how could they participate in understanding what's happening? I visited Syria. I was for a month there after the fall of the regime. And when I was in Syria, I knew less about what's happening in Syria compared with I'm outside, because connectivity is an issue, something that we take for granted these days, to be able to actually have stable internet and check the news and see what's going on and discuss that. That does not exist. And all of these are real challenges for Syria to move forward. But let's zoom in a little bit and see what type of cleavages are there now, what type of tension is happening in this transition. First, we have the Kurdish Arab cleavage or tension inside Syria, and we see that translated into the political tension between Damascus and the autonomous region or the Syrian Democratic Forces in the northeast. Relatively speaking, that has been on a positive track. Very early on, both sides were clear that they want to resolve this issue through negotiations and not to resort to a military confrontation. And the negotiations have been taking place. Almost 10 days ago, we had an agreement between General Mazloum Abdi, the leader of the Syrian Democratic Forces, and the Syrian interim president, Ahmed Shara. The agreement or the framework is very important, but it's also very vague. So it mainly says that we want to resolve this issue, and this is a goodwill, and we're very interested in working together, that there will be only one president, only one army in Syria, but it does not go into details yet. It does not really address the big questions of how will SDF join the Syrian army. One unit or one block, or it's going to be fully integrated into different blocks. What kind of decentralization the Northeast will have, and the relationship between them and Damascus. These are big questions that were mentioned that they will be resolved by the end of the year. And that's a huge challenge to monitor and to see if that will be solved or not. And then we have also the tension with the Druze in the south as well. Also the Druze in Sueda, but all these sub-communities are as fragmented as Syria. So usually when we see some of the comments, one of the Druze leaders, it's also important to remember that most Druze leaders, they don't probably control more than 10 to 15% of society there. You have different leaders, different centers of power inside Sueda as well. But the majority of them, they agree that they want a civil and pluralistic state. And they still feel that Damascus hasn't shown seriousness about that. And I want to highlight here, when we talk about the Druze in the south and the Kurds in the northeast, it's not only ethnic or religious tension. We're also talking about a tension between the center and the periphery, between Damascus and Raqqa, Damascus and Sueda. And that I'm highlighting that because it's not only about these leaders getting into agreement, it's also the structure of the government, the decentralization or centralization inside Syria is key in understanding, will this be different experience or different model than what we've witnessed under Assad or no. And all of that will get reflected on the level of democratization inside Syria. The more I would say we have decentralization inside Syria, that would help to democratize and that would help to also have accountability for those officials in those areas in front of their local population, because we will always ask the question about elections. Is there gonna be elections in Syria? I don't think that will happen anytime soon. For different reasons. One of them is that 50% of the population is displaced. So you have out of every two Syrians, one of them is not at home, one of them does not have an address to vote for. So where would people vote? Who's gonna secure the elections? Who's gonna run for those elections? Are people just gonna vote for warlords if they are held at this point? So it's common in experiences right after civil wars and regional wars and such devastation for elections to be postponed. But usually we can use to balance that with more participation, with more inclusivity of opening up to different or other colors, different components of society to participate in the decision making. We are not seeing that happening yet. We see some inclusivity in the discussions, but not in the decision making. We're still within the 100 days. We just passed the 100 days mark. So again, this is normal with the context, but it's something very important to keep watching. Is that going to be the trend, or is that going to start opening up and changing? We haven't reached the fork yet to be able to judge the experiment. It could go either way, but it's important to keep our eyes on that. So I talked about Arabs and Kurds. I talked about Druze and Damascus, Sueda and Damascus, the center and the periphery. There is, of course, also the tension between conservatives or Islamists or components with Islamic backgrounds versus secular inside Syria. That's also a very serious tension since the establishment of the Syrian modern state. We've seen a constitutional declaration that addressed some of these points, but also kicked most of them down the road for the future to be discussed. Happy to discuss the constitutional declaration more in details in the Q&A, but generally speaking, I would say when we talk about rights and identity, I think it's more liberal than almost every other constitutional document I've seen in the region. But when we talk about the separation of power, it's actually concerning that there is lots of power for the president. I get it. This is after a war. There is an armed group that actually won and controlled Damascus, and we're still within less than 4 months. But also that's not okay for a long time. Especially there is a distrust. If that distrust wasn't there, we'd say it's fine. But there is a distrust with the new authority. It has lots of popularity among many segments of society, but not when we talk about also other components. And lastly, I want to touch up on what happened on the coast as well. Horrible atrocities. It started with an insurgency by Assad's remnants on the coast, and that's a serious challenge by the way. It was coordinated attack at different points and against the security forces of the new interim government. In the response, we've seen horrible massacres and atrocities that targeted not only the armed components or the insurgency, but families in their homes. There was lots of revenge, which also highlights an issue of Ahmed al-Shara, actually, if he's in control over those groups or not. His legitimacy was built after what they called the Victory Conference, uh, and then the unification of all armed groups. So if that continue, I think his legitimacy will be in question because can he were those groups actually, or have they actually been integrated yet or not? And even if yes or not, can he actually control all of them, or is he even control of HTS fighters? With that, I will conclude, and I'm happy to go into details with all these issues. I know also there is regional role of Turkey in the north, Israel in the south, and the Gulf, the US sanctions, Russia, all of that, and how it affects the dynamics inside Syria. Happy to discuss it in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Brahim, for this very comprehensive and thought-provoking presentation. I certainly have a lot of follow-up questions, and we'll get to that during the Q&A. Now I'd like to move to Mersin and to talk about Iraq. Mersin, Iraq today is dealing still with the aftermath of the US-led invasion and occupation, the emergence and remnants of the Islamic State, the presence of powerful militias, external influences, and again, the issue of Kurdish autonomy in Iraq that Ibrahim talked about in Syria. We have a fragile political process dominated by ruling elites and is facing discontent and protests from the people inside Iraq. Is the issue of stability taking precedent over democratization and reforms? What are the shortcomings of Iraq's current form of governance, and based on this ethno-sectarian power sharing? What are the challenges and prospects for reform and for establishing a democratic representative state in Iraq? Very easy questions for you.
Thank you, Tamara. Yes, very easy questions indeed. But I'm going to be inspired by my colleagues who spoke about very difficult topics in a very short time. So let's see if I can live up to this tradition. I wanted to start off by saying something that I always do, and that is analysis of Iraq tends to be tainted by the specter of US intervention, and I actually want to put that aside. It's been over 20 years since the US invaded Iraq, and I think we can start talking about Iraq as a state in of itself, and without the specter of the invasion. And the reason I say that is because most Iraqis actually were born either like shortly before the invasion or sometime after it. So there's very little political memory of it among the youth in Iraq and among most of the population. And it's, not as formative in people's mind as something like the ISIS war or the sectarian civil war, which I think are more critical periods in Iraqi history. So that being said, I'm going to speak about Iraq today. I'm going to make the claim that Iraq is doing better than people think it is, and obviously not as good as it can be doing given its resources. I also think it's really interesting to observe Iraq today, particularly after Ibrahim was talking, because Iraq is almost 20 years after where Syria is right now, and there's so many issues that we're witnessing in Syria that have happened in Iraq and that we can actually draw on. I mean, there's of course the fact that the countries look remarkably similar in terms of their diversity. The same issues of centralization and federalism come up, issues of sectarianism and identity politics. Of course, the legacy of the Ba'ath is alive in the politics of both countries today. There's issue of foreign involvement, almost the same kind of actors are complicit in both countries. And of course, like the shared history of ISIS is familiar across both. Obviously, Syria is a little bit different in that it borders Israel, and I think that creates problems that Lebanon and Syria have that Iraq doesn't have. And obviously, Syria also lacks Iraq's oil wealth, which allowed Iraq to actually exist and persevere beyond a lot of crises that I think would have been a serious challenge had it been a poorer country. I will leave the comparison aside for now and just give a really quick assessment of the state of inclusive governance and democracy right now. So I wanted to start off by talking about representative governance really quickly. And I just want to point out that in the fall of 2025, I think by late November is a predicted date right now, Iraq will be holding its 6th federal parliamentary election since the first one that it held in December 2005. This means we've had 20 years of elections in Iraq. And they are not perfectly free and fair elections, but they're not sham elections either. In these elections, you see the rise of reform parties, you see independents. In the last election in 2021, we had women surpass the quota that we have in Iraq. So we have a 25% parliamentary quota, and more women won than merely 25%. Obviously, we have a lot of issues of continuity when it comes to some political parties. We have the classic Kurdish parties who have been in existence since 2005 and key stakeholders in the government. We have the classic Shia Islamist parties, which have been in important positions of power since 2005, and which just uh, refashion themselves every election into a slightly different party, but are basically the same figures running over and over again. I think there's been a little bit of change in the Sunni community, but there have, of course, been political elites that have been constant throughout it. And I think the biggest question about what the election will look like going forward is whether and how Muqtada Sadr, who is known to be someone who is mercurial, someone who changes his position, someone who withdrew from the last election, whether he'll participate and what that will mean for the government that we'll see emerge from the election. The problem with Iraqi elections is that once they're done, the government formation is really long, and the period of government formation is really difficult for the average citizen because the government comes to a standstill. The other issue with the Iraqi government and the election is that the turnout is getting lower and lower every time. So the first election was enthusiastic, 80% turnout, obviously with the asterisk that there was a boycott from the Sunni community. The last federal election in 2021 had a 43% turnout. And the last provincial council election in the federal election in 2021 had a 43% turnout. The provincial election in 2023 had a 39% turnout. We can expect turnout to be in the 40s or the late 30s in this coming election. There's a lot of voter apathy in Iraq. There's people who are actively boycotting the election because they think that boycotting it will delegitimize the process and the government. But sadly, there's actually no minimal threshold. So this is just wasted votes, essentially. And when polled, and this is really interesting, and despite like what I'm saying about elections, Iraqis don't view their country as democratic for the most part. Like that's been the prevailing view. At the same time, you see the creation of a lot of new political parties led by civil society and by a lot of academics, professionals really interested in running political parties. So there's a lot of political energy and there's a lot of also political pessimism at the same time. Which I think is fairly standard, guessing by everyone's nods and smiles. So the other issue with Iraq that Tamara mentioned, of course, is the issue of consociationalism, and I'm sure Ahmad will talk about this in the Lebanese case, specifically power sharing, and that is something that is a relic of the invasion era, specifically the attribution of seats based on ethno-religious identity. So I actually have the opinion that consociationalism was a necessary step in post-2003 Iraq. I think it would have been really bad if we didn't have it because you could have easily fallen into either tyranny of the majority or like internal violence that the had for the country. There's a lot of people who talk about consociationalism having produced corruption or ineffectiveness in governance. I actually want to push back and say that these have all been issues of correlation, and I have not yet seen anyone prove causation between consociationalism and these outcomes. And I really invite people to look into this more seriously, because if we're talking about a complete restructure of the way the government is set up, then we need to have really strong theories of why that would work out. And I will also say that Iraqi Kurds are very much in favor of consociationalism because it allows them to maintain things like the presidency and the foreign ministry, which are hugely influential. The Kurds also are major power brokers in the formation of the federal government, which leads into the issue of federalism. So I think everyone knows that Iraq has a semi-autonomous Kurdish region. It is nominally a federal state, supposedly a decentralized state, but in reality, there's the Kurdish Kurdish region, and then there's a centralized state of all the other provinces. So it's a very uneven federalism. It's not an ideal federal model. Other provinces have tried to collectively create regions in Iraq, but the government has pushed against them. And so Basra famously wanted to create a region on several occasions, followed the constitutional process for doing so, but was stopped somewhere in the middle. So this was, something that's on the mind of a lot of people. Among the average Iraqi, based on research on this, the federalism is associated a lot with splitting up the country, which is hugely traumatizing for Iraqis to talk about. And I think this is what we're seeing in Syria right now too. The idea that everyone on the outside kind of wants to break the country apart, and that centralization protects the integrity of the country. And you have this playing out into this otherwise centralized state outside of that one federal region. I want to also point out that there is an issue of good governance in Iraq, but that good governance and democracy are separate things, although understandably from the perspective of the population, they should go hand in hand. But in 2019, we saw a big wave of protests in Iraq. We saw that in Lebanon as well. A lot of it was about unemployment, about services, and also like higher level things like corruption and consociationalism. But in response, we've seen a government that calls itself the service government. And it's reached a point where Iraqis are joking now about the number of bridges and roads that are being paved, and like the attention the government is paying to services in order to stem the next round of protests, while maintaining the same political setup it's always had and the same political parties it's always had, and while also slowly rolling back a lot of freedom of speech and rights and liberties. And like good governance, I also think sovereignty is slightly separate from democracy, but the two are spoken of always together. I think one of the biggest issues facing Iraq today is the issue of constantly violated sovereignty. And I think people hear that and they immediately think Iran, and that is absolutely true. There is a lot of Iranian influence in the country, but I think it's also important to remember that the list extends to Turkey, which has been attacking areas in northern Iraq, has established military bases deep into the territory, particularly the Kurdish areas. The US, of course, has been the biggest violator of Iraqi sovereignty. I mean, it invaded the country, and then there were targeted assassinations in the country afterwards. There's issues of mundane sovereignty, like maritime borders with Kuwait. I think it is a little bit misleading to talk about sovereignty and focus solely on Iran, as though if Iran were to disappear, there wouldn't be a power vacuum that would be immediately seized upon by other powerful actors in the region. And I think this just goes to show that what we really need in the country is stability in order to have sovereignty, in order to prevent a lot of this foreign intervention, whether from Iran or other countries. I will conclude by rehashing my argument that I think Iraq is doing better than people think, but not as good as it can be doing. 20 years of elections is a good thing. Elections producing gains for protest-based parties is a good thing. Elections producing gains for women is a good thing. But there also is the issue that the turnout can be higher. The quality of the elections can be a lot better. There's a lot of problems with the way that elections are run that impact a lot of the weaker and less resourced candidates. I will say that Iraqi Kurds have achieved more in Iraq than any other country in the region. There are legal protections for the Kurds. They have a share in the federal budget, a big seat at the table. They're important kingmakers. They're part of the Iraqi government, and they're very powerful members in it. But the concept of power sharing is viewed ultimately as being deeply sectarian and problematic and divisive. And people, I think, are looking forward to a phase in which identity-based politics isn't salient. And finally, I think peaceful transfer of power is a good thing. And we've seen peaceful transfer of power both between prime ministers within the same party and across different political parties. But at the same time, we still don't really have a monopoly on violence. There's a lot of armed groups. And I think the Iraqi case is really important for Syrians to think about. There has been a lot of attempts to bring armed groups under one umbrella, and it's really hard to do so. You can nominally include the Kurds and the structure of the national army, but actually to include them, and obviously there's a lot more armed groups than just the Kurdish Peshmerga, which has been around for a long time and plays a particular role in its area. But this includes like the Iranian-sponsored paramilitary groups and other armed groups. So that is a key issue. So I'm not rosy-eyed, I'm clear-eyed about what's going on in the country, but in a region where we only see a lot of bad news, I also want to highlight that 20 years of elections is, not a bad thing to talk about.
Thank you, Marcin, for all of this, and certainly for the positive perspectives. We need some of those in these conversations, and hopefully we can get back to some recommendations. I would like to maybe address that question to everybody in the second round after we're done with this, just to see, hear your thoughts on these. Before we move to the last speaker, Imad, I want to remind our audience that you can send in your questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom and by email to events@arabcenterdc.org. And now we move to Imad and focusing on Lebanon. Imad, Lebanon's new government is already facing multiple challenges, having to deal with political instability, the economic collapse, corruption, and weakened state institutions, in addition to state control and sovereignty being threatened by powerful internal factions and external influences. What's next for Lebanon's government? How sustainable and/or effective is the power sharing structure and the delicate sectarian balance of the Lebanese system, which Marcin talked about in Iraq as well. And it'll be interesting to hear the Lebanese perspective, which had a longer experience with this. Can the current crossroads in Lebanon lead to a radical change and a reform in the system and structure of governance? Imad?
Yeah, hi, Tamara. Thank you very much. Hello to everybody. Good afternoon and good morning to wherever you are. Glad to be here in the company of such distinguished panelists. Thanks to ACW and CCAS at Georgetown University for convening this webinar. I've been asked, I'm being asked about talking about Lebanon and its democratic development and trajectory, but first, it's important to point out some really very essential conditions the country is facing today that could very well be simultaneously helpful and detrimental to the future of the country and its representative democratic system. First, we must remember Lebanon is coming out of over a year of a devastating war between Israel and Hezbollah that continues today, despite a declared ceasefire since last November, with Israeli strikes and assaults all over the country. The IMF has estimated damages from this war to be somewhere between $8 to $9 billion. At least 4,000 people have died and 17,000 have been injured. Devastation in the south and the southern suburbs of Beirut and in the northeast is overwhelming. Second, the country has only a little over 2 months ago ended a constitutional crisis that lasted for 2 years and 2 months. Said vacuum, constitutional crisis with basically a vacant presidency. That vacuum impacted all executive agencies and stalemated the country's politics. The election of Army Commander Joseph Aoun was a welcome and positive step, but it again consecrated a new tradition of a military leader becoming a civilian president. Obviously, there are constitutional and political safeguards for this, but this tradition points to serious political problems between elites. So we're talking about confessional elites who really use their confessional leadership to either help or obstruct constitutional continuity. Instead of a constituted presidential authority governing the country from November 2022 to January 2025 was in the hands of a caretaker government under Najib Mikati that could neither fully assume the president's powers nor have the legitimacy and trust of all influential political factions to do its job. Number 4, Lebanon has been reeling from a financial crisis, the extent of which is hardly known to anyone, including the country's economists and political class. By the way, this political class itself is directly responsible for the financial crisis because it put together what became a Ponzi scheme of financial instruments and processes that collapsed all at once and changed the country's economic picture. 5, the war between Hezbollah and Israel has created a new political condition in the country where there is room for state building, even a moderate attempt at rebuilding the state and its institutions. Number 6, there appears to be regional and international support to a changed political atmosphere in Lebanon today, after the election of a new president and the selection of a new prime minister and appointment of a new cabinet. Political change in Syria is a historical development that impacted Lebanese politics. It also limited the influence of Hezbollah and Iran in domestic Lebanese affairs. Number 7, changes in the region and the American-Israeli assault trying to create a new Middle East controlled by the United States and Israel are affecting how Lebanese politics is conducted and how the Lebanese plan for the future. These circumstances and conditions are essential for how Lebanese democracy develops from now on. There are important questions in this regard, and I really appreciate Marcin's pointing out the issue of consociationalism. It is a very, very important formula, very good formula for governance, but it definitely had its problems in Lebanon. The first question is, how free is the new president and new prime minister, Nawaf Salam? How free are they in trying to build a state that is supported by a working democratic arrangement? Does consociationalism still work the way it used to work back in 1943 when the country received its independence? In other words, will elite cooperation within the current consociational formula facilitate their attempt at building a democratic state? What has happened in Lebanon over the period of the Syrian presence in the country between 1976 and 2005, and following the departure of Syrian forces in 2005, and the ascendance of Hezbollah, was a democratic sliding toward a situation where might overpowers right and democratic procedures are sacrificed. The new political arrangement after the election of Aoun and the selection of Salam allows for recharging democratic development and institutions, because both men received wide support from a broad coalition of political forces and the general populace at large. But how long would it be until elite cohesion and consensus break down, because elite interests are either not served well enough or are subjected to unacceptable losses? Second set of questions: how amenable are political leaders to essential reforms in the political system and the economy? Do they really want that to happen? Are they interested? Will consociational politics be amended according to the Taif Accords of 1989 that did away with confessionalism in the lower house of parliament and created an upper house of parliament in which consociational politics would be maintained, and advocated for a needed administrative decentralization? Administrative decentralization, as Ibrahim has pointed out, is very, very essential for democratic development. Will the financial crisis started in 2019 be addressed? Will anywhere between $70 to $100 billion of bank deposits by hundreds of thousands of depositors be refunded to them? What mechanism will there be for doing all this? Who is going to be controlling this? How is the financial system going to be working around this essential problem? There appears, however, to be some move toward fighting corruption and asserting judicial power. Investigative Judge Tariq Bitar is renewing his efforts to investigate the Port of Beirut explosion of August 2020. He has recalled former officials responsible for the port. He previously was prevented from conducting the investigation by a coalition of politicians aided by Hezbollah, because initial reports pointed to the responsibility in protecting supplies for the Syrian regime to be used in suppressing the Syrian revolution. We all heard about barrel bombs and all that. A lot of evidence points to the explosion in Beirut to be materials used for that purpose. The third set of questions has to do with the crises that have plagued Lebanese democracy since the independence in 1943. They have always happened when consociation and consensus that is supposedly the basis for the consociational politics, when the consociational consensus clashed with the veto power of every confessional group. In today's conditions, with the Lebanese state weak and impoverished, confessional groups will clash over the spoils of the patron-client relationships endemic in the system. Will Aoun and Salam be able to divide the pie in such a way to serve the interests of all confessional leaders? Will regional and international assistance to Lebanon after the war be enough to do reconstruction and also benefit all confessions? The third set of questions is another set has to do with the regional conditions that surround the country. One is Syria and the change from authoritarian rule to something that so far, unfortunately, is not quite clear in Damascus. Do we have a fully Islamist system in Syria? Who controls what? How is HTS ruling the country? Who is in a political coalition, specific political coalition, to take the country forward? What type of relationship will the new authorities in Damascus have with Lebanon? Unfortunately, over the last week, there have actually been clashes between the Lebanese and Syrian armies across the border. I mean, what was? I still don't understand what the original cause for that was. Now, apparently, a ceasefire has been declared, but still, the idea that these two armies would fight across the border is really very strange. Another actor is obviously Israel, and whether the Zionist state is ready to implement the November ceasefire fully and withdraw from Lebanese territories. Will Israel continue to pursue what it considers to be Hezbollah operatives in Lebanon, or Hezbollah weapons in Lebanon, or whatever that Israel's cabinet considers to be a threat to its security? Another set of questions relates to how the Gulf Arab states are going to deal with Lebanon. There is a new political reality in Hezbollah's weakening, and thus Iran's decreased influence in the country. But will the GCC states trust to supply the needed reconstruction to Lebanon if the country does not implement necessary institutional and economic reforms and address widespread corruption? I will conclude by saying that these questions are essential for understanding how Lebanese democracy develops and guides the country forward. From what is obvious today, there is an attempt by the new constitutional powers, that is Aoun and Salam and their associates, to take the road toward recovery slowly but surely. But the worry remains, as it has always been, in how elites in Lebanon address the crisis that they have helped start, and in how domestic issues overlap with regional conditions that Lebanon cannot escape.
Thank you, Imad. Thank you very much for this excellent overview and the many important questions that are really critical to address at this point. And hopefully we can try to provide some answers in the next session of this webinar. First, I'd like to maybe pose a general question to all of the panelists about recommendations. You know that you've all addressed some important issues and challenges in the countries that you've covered, but I'd like to hear maybe some ways in which we can move beyond these obstacles. For example, how do we address the issue of political apathy and no trust in the system in places where there is a democratic process and some sort of like procedural elections? How do we move beyond a context of identity-based politics in most of these places? But also, you mentioned revolutions take decades. So in the meantime, what needs to be done, both domestically and regionally? We haven't talked much about, you know, the role of regional dynamics and geopolitics and the different actors. I know we mentioned Iran, there's, you know, the Gulf countries, there's Israel that we cannot ignore, but there's also Turkey that's playing a very important role in Syria right now. So I'd like to hear from all of you. You can pick and choose which aspect of this question you want to address, but maybe try to provide some recommendations how to move beyond some of these obstacles and to address some of the challenges. And we can start, do the same order. We can start with May as well. May?
Sure, happy to jump in. I'll be brief. I think I have kind of three sets of recommendations. One is a more general kind of note on Egypt's positionality vis-a-vis Gaza. I think Egypt right now is under immense pressure to accept a bad deal that would eat away at the rights of Gazans and Palestinians and would end up perpetuating mass atrocities. And so one recommendation for all actors involved is to stop creating that type of pressure on Egypt. There's been conversation here in the US about the weaponization of US assistance to Egypt to push them in that direction. That's entirely inappropriate, a violation of law, and it will end up creating a deeply unstable region. We can go greater into detail on this issue, but I just wanted to kind of start off because this is one of the biggest issues that hasn't come up already and is central to a regional understanding of what's going on right now. Domestically, inside Egypt, there are recommendations for the Egyptian government. Many, but maybe if I could focus on some of the rights issues. First, Egypt must meaningfully resolve the pretrial detention crisis, and it needs to do so not by referring people to trial. These people have already been behind bars for years, but rather releasing them and fully closing their cases. If there were charges, they would have been brought at this point, and so those cases need to be closed in their entirety. Second, Parliament should not approve the draft criminal procedure code because that has the potential to set the country back decades. And that is a key issue that will affect so many other issues across the board. And so this is an example of a key piece of legislation where it is not too late to act. More generally, the authorities need to allow free political organizing. They need to stop prosecuting and arresting people for their free expression, for their dissent. Unfortunately, Egypt right now, and much of what we see from the security state comes out of an immense fear that January 25 will be replicated once again. The reality is that we are far from that, but the regime acts kind of in a very insecure manner, and it does so in a way that ultimately destabilizes Egypt, and it creates pressure points, particularly keeping in account the economic situation and the security situation in Sinai and on the regional level. And finally, recommendations for the US and the IMF. The US should follow its own law with regards to conditionality. There are provisions that the US has violated with this last administration on the aid that goes to Egypt that must meet certain human rights conditions. And so at minimum, we should stick to following the law. And the IMF, which is one of the largest sources of funding for Egypt, should work with Egypt much more seriously to help it meet the economic reforms that the country desperately needs. We've seen positive steps so far where the IMF identifies the reforms that are needed, but unfortunately does not follow through. And so what we need to see is that follow through and a commitment that those reforms are actually carried out, not only because they are good for the Egyptian people, but also they will make Egypt much more stable and secure.
Thank you, May. And next, we'll hear from Brahim. And Brahim, Marcin mentioned this a little bit, but also what can Syria learn from Iraq, if anything, as well? Go ahead.
That's a great question because I've been thinking about this. I want to actually start a series to meet and talk to scholars from countries that went through transition to ask them what we can learn from them and to share with them also what's happening inside Syria. I think there is a lot that Syrians have learned and want to learn from Iraq. Sometimes, nations learn the right things. Sometimes they learn the wrong things. So also learning could go both ways. But I think one issue that Syrians, when you talk to them, and Iraq and Lebanon come up, they say they don't want quota systems. They don't want. They look at especially also Lebanon, the democracy in Lebanon, and that they feel that it might become dysfunctional. However, that also does not address many of the fears and the concerns of the minorities in Syria. But one of the differences between Syria and Iraq and Lebanon, that in Syria there is a clear majority. In Iraq, there is a majority, of course, but it's not as large as it is in Syria. And also, I think something that Syria maybe not learn, but depend on. I think there are. We can get some help from Iraq. Like, for example, the KRG administration has been trying to help in mediating between Damascus and the Kurds inside Syria. I hope at some point. I'm glad that last week there was a visit to Iraq by the Syrian foreign minister. I think to open channels between Baghdad and Damascus is extremely important. There is so much misunderstanding between both sides. There is so much disinformation going on, and I think it's crucial for the region, for Baghdad and Damascus to have at least a cordial relationship between both of them. And by the way, there were questions, and also Tamara mentioned that the regional players for Syria, I'm not going to talk about that because on February 13th, hosted by the Arab Center, we had an event called their Syria's Transitional Government, moderated by Khalil Jahshan, and I went through all the countries. So I'll save that time for those who want to go and watch that. But I will comment quickly on the U.S. role, and if there's a question on if the U.S. is playing negative or positive role. I think sanctions are a huge leverage inside Syria. I do call generally on lifting them. It's very important because that will allow people to go back to Syria and oppose the government, pressure the government, participate with the government. We want to rebuild Syria's middle class. And that's also now when Marcin was talking to us about after 20 years of democracy in Iraq and where they are. We do want that as well, to be able to rebuild a political environment inside Syria. And many of the refugees, the millions of refugees, the Syrian ones, they went and they lived in places where they participated in democracies and they were part of them. But for those to go back with the current sanctions, no even internet, no electricity, no heat, it cannot happen. So it's a recipe for radicalization. I think creating a system of reward and punishment when it comes to the sanctions, and to have clear asks for Damascus of what they need to do to have the sanctions lifted. It's very important, first, for the relationship with Damascus. Second, also for Syrians to understand what's happening. If the United States government want to show that they don't only want to sanction Syrians and doom them to fail, they need to tell them why the sanctions have been lifted yet and what should be done by the government. So when the government doesn't do them, we actually create pressure on the Syrian government. So clarifying these dynamics is extremely important. And lastly, I would say also for the United States to depend on its partners in the region, to listen to them. And I would say particularly in the case of Syria, Saudi Arabia could play a huge role. Qatar could play a huge role inside Syria. So also to listen to them and to allow them to lead the way, especially on the issue also of sanctions, to set criteria for that and mediate with the United States is extremely important, because without lifting sanctions, Syria cannot work. Marcin said when she was comparing both Syria and Iraq that one of the differences that we do not have oil in Syria. Syria does not have natural resources. Syria could only prosper if it's stable, because it's a geopolitical space that lots of it could be based on trade, transportation, and services. So it needs stability, and of course, it cannot survive with these sanctions.
Thank you, Brahim. And we have a few questions coming in as well, and there's so much to discuss in very little time. So I'll quickly move to Marcin, and maybe if you want to address the issue of the consultational model of governance, and you've had some criticisms of that, but what are the advantages and disadvantages, and what's the best model in countries where there are various diverse groups? Go ahead, Mercy.
Thank you. So the reason I didn't want to criticize consociationalism from the beginning is because I think it's a good tool for transitioning, because it really puts a lot of people at ease in an initial government. But I think what would naturally happen in a good setting is that you would develop a parliament that was not consociational, and you would move past it organically. And Iraq has the ability to do that because consociationalism isn't rooted in the constitution. So the whole point about the Kurdish president, the Shia prime minister, the Sunni speaker of parliament, that's a norm. It's a very sticky norm, like Lebanon, extremely sticky as a norm, but it's not something that's entrenched in the constitution. The quotas are for minorities and for women, but those aren't really what people talk about when they're talking about consociationalism. They're talking about the Shia Sunni Kurd division of ministries. And like high bureaucratic positions. What this has lent itself to in Iraq is consensus governments, and those governments really don't do any innovative legislation. In fact, they do very regressive legislation, as we've seen in Iraq in the last few months. But naturally, if you get a parliament that is so one of the things I say to people is that if we had an 80% voter turnout in Iraq in the last election, I would venture to say that the extra 40% would probably all vote for independence or protest parties, and add that to what the protest parties achieved, you'd have a majority of new parties in parliament. That would naturally push away the consociational system. So I think the best end to consociationalism is a natural end once people feel comfortable. And I think what it took in Iraq is genuinely, and I don't mean to speak in a sectarian way, but only a sect way, it took the Shia to feel comfortable in their position of a majority and not to have this idea that they're going to be pushed out of power at a communal level. And now I think that's the case in Iraq. I think the Shia are comfortable, the Kurds are comfortable, the Sunnis are comfortable, more or less with like their position in the country, and they don't see themselves as a like a sect that might fall into civil war or violence or be preyed upon. And that's a remarkable thing to say after the ISIS war has only ended not so long ago. So like I said, a useful tool for transition, maybe not a long-term process.
Thank you, Marcin. And next time, Matt, if you can offer some recommendations. And I want to maybe point to the issue of, the outsized power of political and economic elites that you mentioned, which is, an issue not only in the Arab region, we're seeing it here in the US as well. But how does Lebanon move beyond that?
Yeah. Well, for one thing, domestically, there has to be something done with the consociational formula in the country. The consociational formula was addressed in I mentioned that in my remarks, in the 1989 Taif Accords, where yes, let's abolish confessionalism and consociational allocation of consociational power sharing from the lower house of parliament, and just keep it in a Senate kind of upper house that represents the different confessions. Even that, to me, that's still limited, because if the upper house objects to certain things, has a veto power on some legislation, some things that they don't like. So we're back to square one. But the Taif Accords had some really good provisions that can address confessionalism, but can also address the distribution of bureaucratic power. Some regions may want to have a little more, autonomy, so to speak, but not necessarily autonomy, but decentralization is very, very important. And if the central government gives up some of these powers that it has, the things might be a little different. Regionally speaking, the idea of financial support for Lebanon, I don't see anyone providing any such support except for the Gulf states. But the Gulf states are not going to be giving free money to Lebanon anymore. Unfortunately, in 2006, the Gulf states were very, very, very forthcoming in assisting Lebanon after the devastating Israeli-Hezbollah war. But right after that, there were some political factions, mainly Hezbollah, that went after the Gulf states. They really broke with the Gulf states. The Lebanese foreign policy was decided by Hezbollah instead by the Lebanese state. So these are important issues that the Lebanese government, the new Lebanese government, must address. Unfortunately, I honestly do not know what Lebanon can be doing about Israel, considering the American support for Israel and going for whatever Israel wants. I don't know how Lebanon can be able to be, fight that. But it's the new government is can do certain things. Unfortunately, the period in which they can govern is rather limited because parliamentary elections will be held somewhere in May or June of 2026, which is just a little over a year of a new of this new government living. So we don't know how things will shape up, but there are promising things, but definitely I don't think the Lebanese should really forget about the challenges.
Thanks, Imad, and to all of you. We have a few questions from the audience that I'd like to get to. And there's a question about the rise of Islamist movements after the uprisings, or political Islam, conservatism. I think the person asking the question is framing them as one, but maybe there's differences between them. But the question is really, do you think, and I'm quoting here, do you think this is going to take an anti-liberal course in the long run? And you can interpret that as you want. I'd like to get your input on this. And the second question is about the role of the United States. The question here is the US a net negative or positive actor in these four countries? And I'd like to hear from you about the role of the United States currently, but also how can the US play a constructive role in these countries, not only for the interests of the people in the region, but also for the long-term interests of the United States. Please feel free to address one or both of these questions, and we can do the round again and then take another round of questions. Who would like to start? May? You look ready.
Sure. Happy to go for it. Very briefly, I read the question about whether there's a concern of kind of anti-liberal forces taking over. Focusing on the case of Egypt, what we had after the revolution was the election of Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood. They governed for a very short period of time. It was rife with a few constitutional concerns as well as human rights concerns that people were calling them out, reporting on them. But unfortunately, thereafter, what we saw is that his removal in an undemocratic coup and ultimately the takeover of the military, which does not position itself as Islamist, but has been equally illiberal, if not more illiberal. And so unfortunately, in the Egyptian case, we see illiberal forces not tied to a particular kind of religious background, but rather a thing across the political spectrum. What Egypt needs is the space for independent political actors to be able to come forward, because there are plenty of visions for an Egypt that is respecting of people of all backgrounds, that does not favor one religion over another, that is inherently liberal and democratic, that people have been calling for, envisioning, putting forth solutions for. There are paths to that, and they exist. But unfortunately, what we've seen in the Egyptian case is anti-liberalism, whether secular or Islamist. I've already spoken about the role of the US in Egypt, so I think I'll hand it off to my colleagues.
Okay. Ibrahim, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I'll have a brief comment on the role of the United States. When we're talking about what people could learn from each other, we say that sometimes we learn wrong lessons. I think also the United States has learned a lot from the region, but in many cases, the wrong lessons. And I think when it comes to Syria, there is this sentiment or this feeling that the United States doesn't need to engage more, because when it's engaged in also previous cases, it didn't lead to the desired outcome. I think that doesn't mean the United States should not engage. It means that it needs to engage in a different way. It needs to engage less militarily and more politically, more diplomatically, more trying to get regional players together to stabilize Syria. And I do think there is a huge opportunity for Syria to become a stable place and help stabilize our neighbors as well. Imad mentioned the issue of Lebanon and Syria. Syria is a very vital geopolitical area, and whatever it was designed because of its political economy and how it became a state. Syria is designed to spill over. Syria is an area for trading. So whatever happens in Syria does not stay in Syria, whether instability or stability. So I do think that's a huge opportunity to work on and dedicate more diplomatic resources for Syria to at least have a clear policy.
Thank you, Ibrahim. And I'd like to throw in another question here, just as we move to the next panelists. There's a question about whether people fear democracy in the region after how things have unfolded in some countries. Is this a valid concern? And maybe Marcin, you can address any of these questions as you wish.
Yeah, I'll start by saying that really quickly to the US question. Like I said in the beginning of my talk, I've moved on past the US. So just assessing the country as it is. Concerning the thing about Islamists, I actually want to point out that Islamists aren't very popular in the region anymore. And the new parties are the Medini parties or the civil parties, secular, whatever you want to call them. That's a new trend of political parties. I think people get caught up on Islamism because it's you know, an easy foe maybe for some, or like something that's a bit of a boogeyman for others. And there's a lot of analysis that particularly focuses on the Muslim Brotherhood in particular, and like less so on other Islamists. But I actually think they have performed poorly and are, as a result, are not doing well in the region in terms of public opinion generally. About democracy, and this also ties into the question of liberalism. I think people just need to be a little bit more patient. They think a revolution happens in the Middle East and people's top priority is like liberalism. It's like, no, it's not. It's, you know, it's people's priority is economic well-being, and rightfully so. If you were in their position, your main interest would be your economic well-being, the safety of you and your family. But stability and economic well-being create the conditions for having for asking for more rights, for liberalism, for developing you know, other concepts. Obviously, granted that you don't fall into totalitarianism again, but there needs to be a more realistic approach to how countries transition. And this goes to the issue of sanctions in Syria. Sanctions are extremely debilitating, and they always lead to violence. We've never seen sanctions that actually did anything but punish the people who live in the country and do absolutely nothing to the leadership. They always think they create public pressure against the leadership, but like, when has that ever succeeded in any case? I think a lot of policy is very much devoid from looking at what the average person goes through. And I think it really overemphasizes that people who are emerging from authoritarianism need to be like completely invested first and foremost in democracy, as though they couldn't have any other things to ask for as human beings. It's been my pet peeve with a lot of the discourse, even around the Arab Spring and afterwards.
Thank you, Marcin. Imad?
You know, Tamara, you and I know about, we have, a lot of people do know, I think, about the Arab Opinion Index. People in the Arab world are not afraid of democracy. They want democracy. They like democracy. It's you know, sometimes like all the other speakers have mentioned that, you know, in fluid transitional situations like this, you know, some mistakes do happen, and some new rulers are not good case of that. The current Syrian case is also a case of that. So these people have not been in power. That's why they make mistakes. But at the same time, I mean, you know, there is no alternative to in the Arab world than no alternative to democracy. Democratic development is essential. Democratic development is important for economic well-being, and you know, the protection of human rights is the best thing that any leader can do. But definitely, people were not interested in, were not afraid of democracy. Just the execution of For instance, in the Tunisian case, there were circumstances that really made things very, very rough and very tough, and that's why the Tunisian democracy failed.
Tamara, can I come in very briefly on this question?
Absolutely.
Yeah, democracy. I also think that there's a responsibility on advocates when speaking about democracy. Democracy means so many things to different people, and in many cases, it's not a useful term for the everyday person. What does democracy actually mean? It means protection of social and economic rights. It means that you can feed your child. It means that you can get a good education. It means, so we have a big responsibility to explain that and simplify that. The word itself is irrelevant. And this is kind of a critique of many surveys that have come out that have falsely claimed that the Arab world doesn't want democracy. The reality is, when you ask a question like, do you want democracy? People have a million different definitions. And so one, we have to kind of break it down. And two, we as an advocate community have to do so much better than talk about just political human rights, because social rights, economic rights, cultural rights are rights too. And there's room for us to really reclaim the narrative and serve the people, which is actually the role of civil society.
Indeed. Thank you, May, for that. I'll just maybe one last question here from the audience in the last few minutes. There's a question about regional collaboration. How more collaborative and cooperative regional approaches to address these challenges might benefit the entire region. We've talked about, geopolitics and the different agendas of various states in the region. But is there a case to make for collaboration on a regional level for the better of the entire region? And how would that look? Anyone would like to take that on?
I can go very quickly. Yeah, I want to focus actually on regional collaboration among people. One of the greatest gains of the Arab uprisings is, like I said, that we found each other. People who have similar values found each other across the world. There became an opportunity for us to learn from each other's examples, like Ibrahim said, to learn the good things, but also maybe the bad things that we don't want to replicate. So I think creating and investing in spaces where advocates, scholars, policymakers can exchange and learn from each other is more important than ever, but also investing in regional networks that actually do the work. We see this impact, for example, when human rights lawyers come together across border, they've been able to challenge huge companies like NSO Group that was responsible for the Pegasus surveillance software. We see the impact of when folks kind of pool their resources together, learn from each other and work together. That type of the results are much harder to defeat. And so this is a whole topic in and of itself, but I would say there's really something there with regards to cross-regional work and collaboration on the civil society level.
Thank you, May. Anyone else would like to talk about collaboration, maybe at the state level? If there's any potential.
If I may, Tamara, I mean, the Arab region is the least cooperative. Arab states do not cooperate with each other. They cooperate with other states instead of cooperating with each other. And also they cooperate on preventing the cooperation between activists, like May is talking about. They're not interested in cooperation on the people's level, obviously, because that is a death knell for their regimes, and they're not interested in cooperating with each other because they are more dependent on Western economies, on advanced economies that sustain them, basically.
Thanks, Ahmad. And we have 1 minute left. So whoever wants to give some concluding remarks or anything that you'd like to end with that you didn't have a chance to say, please feel free, especially Ibrahim and Mercine, that you haven't commented at the end. Ibrahim, go ahead.
I will just echo some few comments I really enjoyed from Mercine, Ahmad, and May. I think patience and nuance is really key in understanding what's happening in the region, and to break out from some words we always use, from May talked about democracy, and Mercine talked about Islamism, and how we also always define it in a certain way. And of course, the idea of cooperation Ahmad highlighted is extremely important.
Thank you, Mercine. Any last words?
Given the difficult task of closing off the last thing I wanted to say is that we're entering a period where the US is funding a lot less of like important activities in the region that have to do with international development and humanitarian aid. It sounds like it's going to be a really bad time, but I think it's also an opportunity for us to develop indigenous funding, and to stop being so reliant on Western funding. And if we can find ways to do that creatively, whether it's across the region between countries, or even within countries, it's a challenge, but I think it would be worthwhile for us in the long run.
Thank you, Mercy, and that's a great point to end on. And with that, we have reached the end of our time for today's discussion. I really learned a lot. This was a very rich conversation. Thanks to all of you for being part of it, for your time, for your insightful contributions. Thanks to the audience for tuning in. On behalf of Arab Center Washington, D.C. and the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University, thanks to all of you, and we look forward to working with you in the future. The video of this discussion will be available on our website later today at arabcenterdc.org. Thank you again, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the future.